Welcome back to the Security Unhappy Hour, where we bring together a group of security professionals and naturally cheery folks to discuss topics in the cybersecurity community, share knowledge, learn, teach, and exchange ideas. Before we get started, it's important to point out that the views and opinions expressed on the Security Unhappy Hour and related websites are those of the hosts, guests, and authors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any one company. In this episode, we're going to talk about the Exploit Prediction Scoring System, or EPSS. Lisa Bradley, Crob, and I are joined today by Sasha Romanosky and Jay Jacobs. Jay is a co-founder and chief data scientist at Cyentia. Is that right? Did I get that right?
That's fine. That works out.
Cyentia Institute, and currently serves as the co-chair of the EPSS Special Interest Group at FIRST. He is also a co-founder of the Society for Information Risk Analysts, SIRA, and worked for years as a data analyst on the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report. He is the co-author of Data-Driven Security, a book covering data analysis and visualizations for information security professionals. Now, Sasha is a senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation, where he researches topics at the intersection of economics, cybersecurity, national security, and law and economics. That's an interesting topic for us to have on for another time. He is a former cyber policy advisor at the Pentagon and holds a Ph.D. in public policy and management from Carnegie Mellon University and a B.S. in electrical engineering from the University of Calgary, Canada. Sasha is one of the original authors of CVSS and co-creator of EPSS, an emerging standard for predicting software vulnerability exploitation. Thanks for joining us.
Call that OG.
Yeah, OG.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah,
Nice to be here.
this is great. So you gave us a little bit, Josh, of the EPSS. EPSS. Having fun with
Yes.
that. It's emerging standard, right? For exploit prediction scoring system. Okay, so what does that mean?
So at a high level, basically we've built a predictive algorithm, just trained up a model, basically, given a bunch of exploit activity and then information about vulnerabilities, and we merge those two. So we look at attributes and things about a vulnerability that may help us understand whether it's going to be exploited or not. And at this point, we're trying to also say how much will it be exploited. So we know that there's a difference between somewhat exploited in the wild and really exploited in the wild. And so that's one of the things that we're working on moving forward. But at a high level, we want to take any vulnerability, any published CVE, and talk about what is the probability that it will be exploited in the wild.
So how do you do like a calculation? Like, have you just watched for the last? I have my PhD in math. You're right. It's probably a lot of math. But have you just watched for the past few years, like which ones have been exploited versus not, and come up with the mathematical calculation?
Yep, and we're going back about 4.5 years now, actually, more than 2. And so one of our key partners is Fortinet, and they've got huge, massive deployment of their devices worldwide. I think 100,000 plus devices or something, just massive. And so they've been gracious enough to allow us to use their data, their evidence of exploitation, as part of our input into the model. We also are working with Alien Vault and a little bit of Proofpoint in there. And Kenna Security has been a key contributor too. And working with them to try and understand what is going on in that exploitation landscape. So we look for that evidence of exploitation and then try to train a model, use that as evidence, and train a model trying to predict it then.
So one way to think of it is, if you think of just an Excel table, every row is a vulnerability. You have lots of different characteristics of that vulnerability. The CVE description, keywords, some CVSS characteristics, tags for the vendor, tags for this, tags for that. So just lots of different characteristics. And then one of these columns is an outcome. Has this thing been exploited on this day? Yes or no. And it can be as simple as just running a regression based on that. So which vulnerabilities have been exploited and which ones haven't. And so you create this prediction that kind of says vulnerability that looks like this was exploited. And so another vulnerability that kind of has the same characteristics, what do we think its probability of prediction is? So it can be as simple as that. Now Jay, and when I say we, I mean Jay and the data team, but largely Jay, because he's the guy with all the skills in this, has kind of restructured the data. So really what we have are daily counts. So it's a longitudinal data set, it's a panel data set. So for every day, we want to have an observation for, has this vulnerability been observed to be exploited, yes or no?
So you're constantly like feeding in information into this, database?
Yeah, daily.
Yeah.
And so it's different from some of the other efforts in the past where, like CVSS, for example, is let's ask these questions, get the answers, and then put some weights to those answers. Really, we're saying, let's look at history, see what history can tell us, and then see if that history can help us forecast the future going forward. And so it's slightly different. And so we also deal with a ton of data, and like I said, daily. And so my company has been funding and putting up the resources to collect this data daily so that we can look at, the exploitation activity or what CVE has been published today. Let's go out and score them, gather the data that we can for them, all of that stuff. And that's happening daily.
So do you feel like it's like a service or like a collaborative effort of knowledge that you've put together?
That's a good question. What do you mean by this, the collaborative?
Well, I mean, yes, it's collaborative. So we have a working group of 90 plus people, and we have our biweekly calls. And so on the calls, anywhere from 20 to 30 people will join and participate. So it's collaborative. It's volunteer. It's a labor of love, right? We are doing it just like you all are doing this. We are doing it just because we believe in the effort, in the industry, and we're trying to create something. We saw we had an opportunity to create something, right? A better widget, a new capability that has never existed before. And so it was kind of the right people at the right time in the right circumstances. It kind of came together to kick this off. And we're pretty excited about it. So the notion of emerging standard, I mean, that's my language, right? I would like to think that this will become a standard. It's young, so it's emerging. But hopefully as we increase adoption, and people are already adopting it, we've already heard from firms who are integrating this into their decision processes for vulnerability management. And that's exciting.
Right. So thinking if something's on this list, we should pay attention to it a little bit more because it's being either actively exploited or soon to be exploited.
Or it has characteristics that would
exploit. So I just saw something about the CISA that shared a catalog of 306 actively exploited vulnerabilities. So were those on your list?
Good question. I have no idea which particular list that was. They come out often, it seems. They did come out with one that we looked at, Sasha. What was that, like the top 25? It was a couple months ago.
Yeah, they tagged it as like the most exploited vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
Whatever that they had seen. And it was a collaboration between
multiple agencies.
Yeah. So the UK,
Australia, I think, was part of it.
Australia, FBI, and
but we looked at those, and there was probably, I don't know, like 6 or 8 that were rated very low by EPSS, which is interesting. And then we went and looked at the evidence of exploitation, and there was none in there. And so, that actually started us off on a huge push to try and figure out how they determined that they were being exploited in the wild. Did they have some other secret data source or some knowledge of something that we had no way to know? And we actually didn't get any answers. We got some anecdotal things from some people saying it was a little bit more subjective than actual observations. That some people told us that, but we really don't know how those lists are being compiled or where they're getting information from. But if anybody's listening and is part of that, we would love to talk about how those lists are compiled.
Yeah. No, I'll share the link with you later. It's pretty cool. A lot of these are older CVEs, but they talked about how quickly people should address them based on them being on this list, which, you know, with the executive order and all that's coming on, it's like, is this going to be another mandate that's going to happen to us that we have to, you know, look at this list and quickly address them? I'm not sure of that.
Well, it is for federal agencies, right? It turned into a binding operational directive, so they kind of need to. And that kind of speaks to the heart of what we're trying to do, which is provide more information to the community based on exploitation, right? So if in the past, you know, it's been on severity score because that was the best we had, and if it was high severity, then like, ooh, okay, let's go. But what we're finding, and it's a bit of a tough pill to swallow, that CVSS isn't a good measure of exploitation, right? It's not a good predictor of.
Well, that was the temporal score aspect, right?
Well, the idea behind the temporal group was, and the metrics was that it was supposed to kind of get to this sense of, do we have proof of concept? Is there a patch available? Have we seen sort of evidence, something. But it was all based on, I won't say quite opinion, but obviously a temporal component, right? So when the initial score comes out, what information do we have? But we found over time that it was never really updated. Some firms were using it that way, but in practice, it never really took off. So when people talk about CVSS, generally what they talk about is the base score, which is really just a function of severity. But again, so what we realized, you know, is that it's not good. It's not a good predictor of exploitation. And so what that means is that we haven't had any good model or information or data or anything to tell us about, okay, fine, I get that the severity is high, but will this thing be exploited or not? And so now we're introducing more information, providing to the community to help. What we hope will provide them, you know, better ways of prioritizing.
Yeah, and it was interesting. You brought up CVSS several times, and I could see a lot of people getting confused between CVSS and EPSS just because of the acronym. But there's
so many S's.
Really, yeah, too many S's. But CVSS is really it's potentially a component of data that's used by EPSS, but it's very different ultimately, right? Because of the predictive nature of EPSS and what you're trying to accomplish with that.
Right.
Yeah. For CVSS, like if you look at some of the questions that they're asking, like how accessible is that vulnerability? Is it, you know, can it be remote, or, you know, does it require authentication? Or I can't even remember what the CVSS question is. But, you know, that type of thing also factors into EPSS. And in our first version, I actually made the conscious choice not to include CVSS because at the time I felt like we were competing with it. And I didn't think it would be fair to say we're doing better and, oh, we leverage all of that data too. So in that first version, I did not include any CVSS, but the iteration we're working on now, we're including it, and it's a really good contributor. We're including the questions and the answers to the questions that NVD is publishing, not the scores themselves. So just looking at when somebody answers, you know, this question this way, it's going to have this kind of impact in our model.
Yeah, it's again the characteristics of the vulnerability that you're looking at, not so much the score itself, right? Got it.
Right.
Yeah. The number itself is not a good predictor, but some of the characteristics, some of the metrics are, which is kind of helpful. I think that that makes sense. Yeah, it should be really thought of as a decision, like an expert, decision support system, something, right? And it's fundamentally different. So EPSS is based on data and sort of like, what do we observe in the wild here? Which is appropriate for a changing threat.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think it's also good to say that EPSS should not be the decision. I would not encourage that at all. It is just looking at the exploitability. And then I think organizations that have a vulnerability want to look at the exploitability, but also what is the asset? What data is there? How accessible is it? All of that other stuff needs to factor in there. So we want to be part of that decision. I do not recommend treating EPSS as the decision. So that whole formula of risk gets so complicated. And I knew that we just wanted to focus on one part and just see if we could do that well. And then maybe we could do more later, but that's all we're doing right now.
So speaking of letters and numbers, have you folks looked at, are there any correlations with CWE, which is kind of the root cause, the programmatic error that was made to make the vulnerability happen?
You're striking one of my nerves. This is good. CWE is how do I word this? It is it's a source of frustration for me, because it is the old joke is like it's so cool that it's so flexible as SendMail, if people have ever worked with SendMail. But the bad thing is that it's super flexible like SendMail.
Cheers, sir.
Right. So yeah, I mean, like there are so many views, and there's such a hierarchical nature that you could, depending on who's rating that vulnerability for the CWE, you could take a SQL injection and could have one of, I don't know how many different CWEs could apply to a SQL injection. And so depending on the hierarchy and where you get in that level of detail and things like that, and then because you've got different views, you get a good potpourri of CWEs assigned. And so far, the actual CWE identifier has not been a strong indicator of exploitation. And I think that it's part of that hierarchy.
I get your point. I feel like CWE is something more that we do learning to try to re-educate people about what they might have missed or what their SDL practices should have been better with. But the exploitability, like I agree with you. Like,
it would just be curious. I do a lot of SDL work, and I would have hoped that we would be able to accurately identify the root cause of the problem, and maybe there was a nice correlation saying if you do this problem, you're gonna be more likely to get owned.
Yeah. But part of the challenge is like NVD has their own defined view for CWEs. And then when you look at the data in NVD, I think it's like 70% are actually in that view. And then there's like a whole bunch that aren't. I don't know if it's 70%. I don't remember anymore. But there's a whole bunch of defined CWEs that aren't even in the NVD view in the NVD data. And so it's a really, there's sort of a data cleanliness problem around CWEs for me. But I think it's a truly awesome standard. I mean, to be able to put that and have all of that language on there to explain to people what the weakness is behind a vulnerability, I think there's a huge strength in that. So
I would agree. There's a lot of work to be done. It hasn't been effectively and consistently implemented across all reviewers.
Yeah.
While I own the talking stick, I was curious, is the standard you guys are proposing, is this something, could I use this to predict exploitability in both hardware and software, or is it primarily one or the other?
This is a interesting topic, because it's not only just hardware and software, but also like software in ICS devices or medical devices or desktops. I mean, like these are not all the same, right? And so right now we're trying to take, I don't know how to say it, baby steps. And we built one model that covers it all. And for, the 80% of the vulnerabilities that are in corporate environments on the network, it's probably going to work pretty good. But when you get into like some of the hardware things, or, like automobiles or, medical devices or something like that, it's probably not going to perform well. And I honestly don't know how it will perform, because I haven't looked specifically at any of these sub segments.
Well, it's like you need to like feed in different information for different, parts that we're in. And it's like, you got to start somewhere, right?
Yep.
So you start somewhere and get adoption somewhere, and then you could expand and expand and expand.
Yep.
I think it's okay to say we haven't evolved into that space yet.
Yep.
Yeah, that's Skynet. That's how you get Skynet, Lisa.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Because like what Jay's describing is, because a lot of the data comes from Fortinet and these other providers that are creating sensors based on publicly facing internet activity, right? That's where the sensors are created. That's what's going to be detected, right? Like we don't have exploitation feeds for medical devices. And so to use EPSS to predict exploits medical devices is a bit of a stretch, just like ICS, just like cars, just like all these other things. But there's no reason it can't be extended and adapted to fill all of those roles. We just need more data sources.
More
So
data,
there's kind of a chronic call that we have, to the world, to anyone who will listen, that if you have exploit data, if you're systematically collecting exploit data, let us know. And if you're interested in participating in integrating that into, the EPSS stuff, we would love that. And that could come from network sensors, from IDS, from honeypots, right? Like
government,
I mean, private sector, like everyone and anyone, right? Just that systematic collection, and that will help fill these gaps that we know we have, frankly, but there's no reason, there's no reason we can't expand it into any of these other areas. So right now everything is keyed off of CVE, but again, conceivably we could reach, we could talk about different configurations and any other kind of weakness that doesn't have a CV, right? Like that is possible. We're just not there yet.
Yeah, well, you're only as good as the knowledge that's being fed to you, right?
Right.
So when we think about that, I mean, is it more that you're trying to protect a company's infrastructure, or more on the product side and the exploitation of a product that it might be in a customer's hand?
I think it's more on the organization side, but there's no reason that it can't be both. But it's definitely more at the the organization level, because Fortinet is all organization. I don't think they have any devices in a home, so we're not going to see activity there. So what we're training to is corporate environments, and I think that's where it's going to perform the best.
Yeah, it sounds like you might need like a pledge from a lot of companies who are doing this threat intel to feed into you to get this. I mean, like I was talking about the, what the cybersecurity infrastructure security agency has, but I mean, there's so much other knowledge that a lot of companies have, and maybe that's a way to make it stronger.
Yeah. There's a challenge with that. That a lot of the threat intel sources, they will identify, the indicators of compromise and all these indicators, but there's a step after that says this indicator is associated with this CVE, and that last half step isn't being done by a lot of threat intel places. And so we'll get a lot of threat intel, but then to take all of that and say, oh, this is actually this CVE or something like that, that last step just isn't happening. And so there's still a gap, I think, in our data collection.
Yeah, one of my past companies, which was IBM, I'll talk about them. They had a really good X-Force, and they were paying attention to after the fact when a CVE was actually being exploited. I thought it was a great wealth of information. Not a lot of companies were doing it, so I was happy to know about that.
Yeah. We've had a hard time reaching IBM, by the way, to talk about X-Force.
Oh, I have some contacts there. It's been a while, but yeah. So typically when we do like a security advisory for products, right? We talk about the CVSS score, and we usually leave off the temporal and the environmental score. Do you see companies starting to put this like information from your system in, or more just look somewhere else jointly with it?
That's a good question. Sasha, what do you think? I mean, we're seeing people put the score out there, and all we're...
Go ahead.
Or do you see like maybe using it in the background where like a company might be using this to potentially expedite how quickly they address something? Like, where is it? Is it in the customer view, or is it in more like the industry view where we're trying to pay attention to it?
All the above. So like, I think from a PCERT perspective, one of the things that we've talked about, and actually we were talked about with Katie about this, about trying to create some sort of an API for PCERTs, that they could look at a CVE that doesn't have a CV identifier yet, fill in the attributes of that vulnerability, submit it, and get the estimated EPSS score, so that they could get some rough estimate of exploitability moving forward before it's public. And so that might say, hey, this is going to be really exploitable. Let's back off a little bit on what we're doing, or speed it up, or do something like that. Just figure out how to approach it. And then once it's out there, I think the consumer might be able to look at the exploitability score and say, hey, this is really exploitable, and it's really, prevalent in our network. Those two pieces of information make me want to look at more, are these important assets? Are they internet facing, whatever, all the other things that would help decide to remediate those.
So yeah, the primary use case was for network defenders. Say, look, we have, right. We have all this public facing, all these public facing IPs and all these applications and all this exposed stuff. We run our scans, and right now we're getting all these vulnerabilities. We need more vulnerabilities than we have resources. We need to prioritize. How do we do that? Well, it's some combination of everything Jay mentioned, asset value and CVSS. And that gives us this ranking of prioritization. Oh, but now, look, we kind of care about exploitability and how likely these things are to be exploited. Let's introduce that into our, decision strategy, and maybe we come up with a different prioritization. The question about, can it also be used for advisories, like for PCERs, for vendors, when they post, vulnerabilities in their products? It makes sense to have a CVSS score because that's very static. Those are static pieces of information for the most part. And we've really thought hard about, does it also make sense for vendors to put an EPSS score in there? And I mean, I think yes, because, it gives everyone kind of some information. But we have this curious challenge that because of, the ingenuity of Jay and the data team in collecting information daily, we're creating new scores daily, which means that, unless some vendor in their advisory has a facility for updating the EPSS score daily, it becomes aged, right?
Yeah.
And
well, that's the
really
problem with the temporal
that.
score of CVSS.
Yep.
It's like,
yeah, exactly.
It becomes like stale.
So how do you get around that, right? There's information that you want, but it's changing, but you need to kind of package it. You need to provide it to customers. And so how do you do that? Well, it's not, at the end of the day, it's not that difficult. There's a CSV file that anyone can go download, and, pages are created dynamically, and, the world of web hosting and web creation has changed since when I was involved. So it's all very dynamic, and it's on the cloud probably somewhere. But it probably wouldn't take too much coding to pull the EPSS score. And it's refreshed every day, or like on the fly instantly, right? Like that's conceivable. It takes a bit more work, of course. And I don't know if everyone is going to be adopting that right away, but there is a solution there.
Using the power of cron and grep and wget.
Totally.
I'm pretty sure you could probably cobble something together in about 10 minutes.
Yeah.
That particular architecture was in my mind when we developed the API. Like that. That's all you need to get it to work.
That's great.
That runs most of the internet.
You
those three utilities.
Yeah. So there is a bit of, kind of positioning and a bit of some challenges based on kind of as a function of what we're creating, right? It's also true that, again, the CVSS score is static, and so that's always going to hang around a CVE. It's probably not going to change much. There can be some variation in scores across different people, whatever. But again, for us, because the scores are changing, we need to convey to people that, look, that's okay, right? We're dealing with a new paradigm. We're dealing with a new standard that is by construction going to change because threats are changing. And so we may acquire new data, we may develop new models, we may tweak our models, we may do all kinds of things, and the scores are going to change. So we need to accept that, and we hope we can convey and generate enough trust in users and sort of the world and you all that people recognize that and kind of be comfortable with that and find a way to integrate that into their practices.
Sasha, your statement actually generated an idea in my head.
Mm.
How does EPSS account for different deployments? So let's say there's a Boggle in an Apache web server, and how do you account for the nuances of the security architecture of Windows versus Fedora versus Ubuntu versus AWS image? How does EPSS handle those variations?
That's a really great question. And once we get into the detail like that, the answer is it doesn't. It basically
It's a hard problem.
treats it at the CVE level. And so what we'll see though is something, like in an Apache thing where it could be in multiple products, or like OpenSSL or some library vuln where all of a sudden it's in, 140 products or something. What we'll see is that all of a sudden we see 140 vendors being affected by it, and that's going to greatly increase essentially the attack surface and the score in EPSS. Okay. So it's at that CVE level. Yeah.
So
you mentioned Apache, and I just think about Heartbleed, and I think about the Apache Struts issue that that world that we had that blew up.
That's why it's an issue.
It blew up everybody, right? Because of the credit scores and all that fun stuff. So
it's fine.
But I feel like there was a lot of companies that were saying this is being actively exploited. You need to fix it quickly, and maybe. Were they paying attention to that? I know Cisco Talos said that for the Apache Struts issue that we all know very well. Maybe if they fed this into their system, into their tooling, it would have escalated it automatically. I don't know, instead of trying to look for a post.
Yeah. And like I said, it's really crazy when the Fortinet data allows us to say how widespread is this. So when we see something being exploited in the wild, there was a stat that we published. It was 75% of exploited in the wild vulnerabilities are hitting less than 1 in 11,000 organizations or something. So 3/4 of the vulnerabilities being exploited in the wild are hitting 0.0001% of orgs or something, And so when we say it's being exploited in the wild, I hope that we can advance the conversation to say, it's been exploited a lot in the wild, and what does that mean? It's been exploited a little bit. We've had some trickles. And so I think treating exploit in the wild as a binary, hopefully, is something that we can start to treat as a historical thing, and we can move forward and talk about other things with exploitation.
Yeah,
so,
go ahead.
Please, no, please.
So that, so as we mentioned, we're starting small, right? What can we do? Right. Mm-hmm. We also have a list of things we want to do, right? Ultimately, it'd be nice to think that this becomes a foundation, a bit of a laboratory for developing theories and better understandings for attack behavior, right? Wouldn't it be nice to explain attack behavior more than just kind of predict some stuff or an attempt to predict some stuff? We're not there yet. Some people are working on that. Other researchers in different areas are looking to develop better thinking and better understanding and better theories for how attackers behave. We might all think they're very super sophisticated, but maybe they're not. Maybe they're lazy like all of us, and So, but we have revealed preferences, right? We have these evidence of exploit, and so let's try and use that. So that's kind of one point. We have these lofty goals that long term, hopefully we can advance our understanding.
But you're doing it through through FIRST, which is a free.
I've heard of them.
Yep.
That's how we all met. A free service. So it's all volunteer time, right?
Yeah.
Sure. And I think a lot of us are kind of researchers at heart, and so we're interested in pursuing these questions and identifying the questions.
We have to answer them anyways, right? And we're always managing risk for our companies, so why wouldn't we want to figure out another angle?
I don't do anything.
No. Yeah.
And EPSS started as research that I was doing with Kenna, and Kenna. Man, they have such awesome, they've got 300, 400, 500 companies that submit their vulnerability scan data. And so working with them, I get to see the other side, how quickly are things being remediated, how widespread, all these things. And that actually started it because I started working with vulnerabilities back then. This is 4 years ago. And it just started raising all of these questions. Like, first there's 180,000 whatever published CVEs, and we're seeing like 2% being exploited. That is an insanely small ratio. Why is that when like every company has, thousands, if not millions of open vulnerabilities? Why are we seeing such a small proportion of those being exploited? And questions like that sort of led to trying to understand the attacker mindset more. Or some are way more exploited than others. Why? And can we use that then to predict new vulnerabilities and how exploited they're going to be? And that was the birth of EPSS.
So I think I know the answer to this question, but looking at EPSS, this seems super useful for a CSIRT, a corporate security team. Yeah. It looks like it would also be useful from a vendor perspective, not a PCIRT necessarily, but probably like an SDL program. They need to monitor ongoing stuff.
PCIRT though, right, Crob? It's just maybe we just didn't evolve into it.
But my question would be, from your community, who are you seeing that's adopting this, and kind of what steps are you both taking in your community taking, kind of expand the adoption of this?
I think the primary adopter we're seeing right now is not directly the first group you mentioned, the individual incident response groups, things like that, but the companies that sell to them. And so like they are the ones that want to provide the intel Vendors. Exactly. They want to, provide the vulnerability intelligence. And so they want to use this to help inform their customers. And I think that's the early adopters that we're seeing.
Well, also the network defenders, right? We've heard from a number of people who've reached out and who have spoken in our meetings about, look, we're integrating this into our practices. And so we want to press them, right? We want to understand what works for them and what doesn't work, and how they're integrating the scores exactly, and how it's changing things. It's a long conversation because everyone's, trying to get comfortable with it. But
so anyway. How are you growing your community? How are you getting further adoption and penetration? This is a great idea.
Yeah.
Well, we hang out with wonderful people like you.
Must be talking about Lisa. I'm not wonderful
in these lovely podcasts. I mean, look, it's a long game, and so it's word of mouth, and we reach out to friends and friends of friends, and you hear it, and we talk about places, and someone else hears it, and their interests reach out. So we have, like I said, we have a SIG now of 90 plus people, nice. Made up of government folks from the US and UK. Other folks in Australia, vendors, researchers, and I'll call them network defenders. So it's everyone else, all the companies that actually have to manage their vulnerabilities and sort of do something with them. And it's a great crowd.
How do you see this influence? You mentioned a few times this is an emerging standard or something you'd like to see become a standard. How do you see this actually influencing either standards or government agencies? Things like the EO we just saw. What do you see in the future for this? Yes.
Well, so right now, one of those binding operational directives by DHS says that federal agencies need to patch vulnerabilities within certain SLAs based on CVSS score. So one way is to say, like, well, maybe not just CVSS, maybe CVSS and EPSS, or just EPSS, or kind of some combination. So any other policies that are driven, solely off of CVSS, we would say, like, look, well, there's this other information there too. So maybe there's a way to combine that stuff, combine both of these sets of information. So on the EPSS website, hung off of FIRST, we have sort of a user guide and a bit of explanation, description of, how it can be used. And so we describe how, there's a scatter plot that anyone can create based on information CVEs from their network to plot, for every vulnerability, here's a CVSS, EPSS score, and you plot that. And now you can use that to prioritize your vulnerabilities. Great. Well, so you could do that at an organization level. You could do that at a subnet level, at a server level, at a multinational corporation level, or at a federal or a federal government level, right? You can plot all the vulnerabilities that you see in the IP space throughout the US and plot that and see what that looks like. And then you can do all kinds of fun things with it. You can see how it changes over time. You can compare it to other organizations or other networks or sister networks or like whatever. And that's pretty fun. We mentioned SBOM before, because that's a topic du jour.
And drink.
So, so what can you do with an SBOM? Well, one thing I think you can do with an SBOM is for all the software products that are listed there, you can look up the vulnerabilities through CPE or whatever, look up all the known vulnerabilities for those products. And so boom, now you have a list of CVEs. Well, what can you do with a list of CVEs? Well, you can go collect the CVSS score and the EPSS score, and you can plot that. So now what you have is a scatter plot of an SBOM. And you can compare it maybe against some other SBOM. You can track that progress over time to see how things are changing, and that becomes kind of cool. Now, if you were very blasphemous with your mathematical operations, you could try to reduce all of that, multiply those scores and add them together and create a single score, a single risk metric for your SBOM. And, you know,
let me write you a sonnet.
Let's just start with first, like producing the SBOM, but I totally get where you're going.
Making the SBOMs easy.
So, but the point is that then it becomes, now you can actually visualize an SBOM, which is kind of an amazing thing, right? Like I wouldn't have ever thought of that before until I did. And so, but I think that's a fun kind of opportunity for people. And that's just now because you have a list of CVEs, right? We also, on the site, the EPSS site, we also have a graphic showing actual exploit data for a sample of CVEs, showing all of the days in which these CVEs were shown to be exploited, were known to be exploited, and the date when the vulnerability became publicly disclosed. And you can see the patterns, and it just blasts in your mind. It's the best kind of eye candy to look at it, to stare at, to see these patterns and these intricacies, right? Is there correlation between vulnerabilities? Is vulnerability chaining going on? Well, I don't know. I mean, it kind of looks that way. You see all kinds of fragmentation across these vulnerabilities, exploitation. Like, what is explaining that? I have no idea. That gets really fun, right? And then your mind just starts to churn about all these possibilities. And you don't even need us, right? You know, to do that, right? You know, Intel and Dell and IBM and like anyone can go collect that information themselves based on their own sensors and create those kind of visualizations and kind of go through these exercises. And that's a pretty amazing opportunity.
Could you see this being used maybe a little abusively by some vendors? So let's say you created a way for people to use this to calculate, you know, they found this kind of a vulnerability and there are these certain characteristics. You plug it into the system and it says, oh, the exploitability of this vulnerability is really low. So therefore, I might deprioritize fixing it, or I might not fix it at all.
Yeah.
What would you say to vendors that start to think that way, that, hey, this is a tool that I can use to help manage my workload? And
I think there's companies that already do that.
Well,
but yeah.
Well, but if your question is this driving some perverse incentive by attackers?
Yeah.
Right. That's an open question. Now, we wouldn't have thought that, you know, any attacker is going to look at our score and somehow make a decision that they wouldn't have otherwise made to either launch an attack, develop some malware, right, kind of fire it off, or not. Then again, there seem to be stories now that based on this press release that CISA just launched of these 300 odd vulnerabilities, people are now starting to see exploitation against some subset of those. So like, what do you do?
Right. I want to be a bad guy. I now know that I could probably exploit these easier. Yeah. Or yes, bad person. Exploit these easier because they're on some lists or their ranking is a certain way. So now I can start to attack these. You're right. There's that side. for sure.
But it's the other way around that I was thinking about. I was thinking about it from the vendor's perspective. And that was, if a vendor using this, maybe not even intentionally, right? Let's assume they weren't trying to be somehow or somehow to reduce their transparency, but they're using this to manage their workload or to communicate better. But if they look at the exploitability of a vulnerability, they might say, well,
I see.
Right, I'm not going to fix this.
It's not that I don't think that they would not want to fix it, but they're going to say, this is so hard to exploit.
Yeah, but that's the point, right? That's the dangerous, it's a very dangerous assumption to make. And this is what I was trying to tease out. Ultimately, that's the wrong way to use this, because right now it may look like it's not very exploitable, but that doesn't mean it's not going to become. And the whole point of fixing security vulnerabilities is building trust with your customer base by actually addressing these issues and closing those gaps. It may not be exploitable today, but it may become more exploitable tomorrow.
Yeah.
Sorry, I filled in the blanks there.
There's a ton of things to touch on in what you were just saying. And there's a direction that I kind of want to take the conversation that is interesting, and that is the EPSS score itself is a probability, which is both really cool and really terrible, because most people get thoroughly confused with a probability. And David Spiegelhalter, a statistician out of the UK, has this great quote where he's like, I never understood why people found probability so unintuitive and difficult. And after years of studying it, I figured out because probability is unintuitive and difficult. And so, but the probability, so like we'll give a CVE like a 2% chance of exploitation in the wild. And we've got time frames around this. It's got a 2% chance of exploitation. The new algorithm is going to say in the next 30 days. And so a 2% chance in the next 30 days seems low. And so we also include the percentile. Where does it rank? Like that a 2% I think might be, I don't know, top 60%, about 40th percentile. But what that means is that everything that we've rated 2% of them are going to be exploited in the wild in the next 30 days, right? So there is no low. It's just a lot less frequent. And we've had enormous debates and discussions about, should we make it a 1 through 10? Should we make it a high, medium, low? Should we set cutoffs? And I think probability allows so many things to happen. There's so much math and fun math you can do with it. And so when we say 2%, that means 2% of these are going to be exploited. And so it's kind of hard for an organization. I mean, they still can do it and they still can misuse it, saying, hey, 2% or even 1%, that seems really low. We're going to put it on the back burner. But 2% or 1% are still exploited.
Every company has a risk calculation of how they figure out how quickly to address issues.
Every company should have a risk calculation.
You're right.
Yes.
There you go. Should. Right. So I do think that like what you're bringing to the equation is beyond the CVSS score, and therefore a company, especially if you're looking at someone that might have 400 vulnerabilities to address, which ones are they going to which ones are they going to address first, right? And how do you prioritize them? I think this is great. Like I
think it's an excellent tool to add to a risk management team's tool belt, something to help them understand what could happen and where they might need to take some extra action.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yes, Sasha, Jay, thank you so much for joining us. This has been really engaging. I think we have more topics to cover than we have time for right now, but I'd like to bring you back on for a further discussion on this, but also talking more about government policy and how this might be impacting us in the future.
All day long.
Yeah.
Talk about it all day long.
Thank you both for joining. Thanks everybody for listening.
Thanks so much. Take care. Bye.